Welcome back. I believe I am fortunate in my sleep habits. When I go to bed, when I put my head on the pillow, generally I'm asleep within a minute. If I'm still awake 5 minutes later, I am wondering what is wrong. And generally I can sleep through the night, don't have any issues, wake up in the morning fairly rested, feeling pretty good, and just thinking about what I have to do usually gives me enough stress to get out of bed and get going for the day. When I worked at the group home with adolescents, many of them had sleep disturbances of various kinds. Sometimes they had trouble falling asleep. Other times they would fall asleep, but then they'd wake up a few hours and couldn't go to sleep for maybe hours. And I think as I listen to people, that's not unusual that sleep disturbances are common for many people. And they can be caused by a variety of things, from simple things like too much screen time or caffeine too close to bedtime, to things like maybe certain drugs you might be using, or pain, restless leg syndrome, shift work, poor sleep habits, sleep apnea. And then there's, of course, more serious things like trauma and fear, and where your depression or anxiety or the stress, or your mind is just going with the things of the day, or maybe thinking about the next day, and your mind is going, or you might be reflecting on something. Why did this happen? Maybe thinking about the past, or concerned and fretting about the future, and it all can be a great disruptor of good, peaceful sleep. In our story today, found in Matthew chapter 8, verses 23 through 27, we have a story as well about sleep, and it goes like this. Then he got into the boat, that is Jesus, and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us! We're going to drown!" And he replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Like, you just imagine the scene. Put yourself in their sandals, if you will. Evening has come. It's been a long day. They've been watching and following Jesus around as he taught and as he healed. And now they have this opportunity maybe to get a little bit of space from the crowds. And so Jesus says, let's take a trip across the lake. Now, the Sea of Galilee, the lake that they're going to be traveling across, is about 8 miles wide, 12 miles long. And it's 700 feet below sea level, with large hills, mountains, if you will, that rise 3,000 to 4,000 feet around it. And it has this unique geography in that the waters are quite warm, and the air right on the water would heat up, and it would rise, and then it would encounter the cold air coming down from the hills or the mountains, if you will, and it would create turbulence. And it wasn't uncommon for winds to pick up, and there'd be turbulence and dangerous winds. So unlike for what many of us usually see our lakes and the winds go down at night, it was not uncommon for there to be storms in the evening, and for it to be windy and so on. And this is what they run into. In fact, it's not just a little bit, it is a furious storm where the waves are coming into the boat, across the boat, the bow of the boat, into the boat. It's starting the water's accumulating in the boat, and the boat is starting to ride lower and lower, and the situation, of course, we know will just get worse. And so even the fishermen are scared. They're used to this kind of stuff, but they're scared too. This isn't looking good at all. They're in danger of being swamped. And where is Jesus? Mark tells us he's in the back of the boat asleep on a cushion. No fretting there. He's asleep. Right? He's not helping. He doesn't seem concerned, right? He's just asleep. Now, how would you be feeling? Probably afraid, fearful, anxious, maybe annoyed. He could be bailing or something, couldn't he? What would you say to him? Well, Matthew records them saying, Lord, save us, right? Help! We're going to drown. And Jesus has two responses. And one is, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? And the second response is that Jesus takes care of the situation, rebukes the winds and the waves, and it becomes completely calm. Going back to that first response, why are you so afraid? How would you respond? Are you kidding me? Look around you. It seems obvious. We're in the middle of a storm. We're taking on water. We're going to drown. What do you mean? Why are we afraid? And Jesus doesn't seem to offer any empathy here. Right? He doesn't see, well, I can see why you're afraid or you're anxious or you're stressed. I understand why you're freaking out. It's But in this place of terror, he calms the storm, but he also offers them a rebuke. He says, where's your faith? Do you still have no faith? After all you've been seeing, after you hear me teach, you see me heal people, what are you afraid of? And how do you think you would have felt as a disciple? How might you have reacted, responded, whether in your head or actually say the words outside? Would you have any empathy for those disciples in that situation? And it sort of pokes me a little bit and goes, well, what's our faith level? We've heard the stories of Jesus. We've had our own experiences. We've heard the experiences of others. How would we respond in a similar situation? Or maybe nothing near that dire. But how would we respond? Something less dramatic, even in something less dramatic. How do we respond in situations where we ask why? Situations where we find ourselves stressed or anxious or depressed, where we find ourselves in distress and fear rather than experiencing the peace of God that we've been talking about. Right? A peace that isn't diminished or exterminated by circumstance. A peace that is beyond understanding, in a sense, meaning it'll blow you away. The kind of peace that we're talking about that God offers, that is available to us if we take hold of this, is a peace that doesn't, in some ways, doesn't make sense because it'll just blow your mind. Because it's not temporary. It's not based on the circumstance. This is the kind of faith, this is the kind of peace that Jesus is suggesting the disciples might want to look into, right? Why are you afraid? And we've been talking about how do we get a hold of that peace? And we've talked about behavior, knowledge and behavior, obeying God's principles. The idea of having to do with forgiveness and guilt, accepting God's pardon so we can have that kind of peace. Thirdly, focusing on God's presence, right? Do we focus on our problems or do we focus on God's presence and his ability? And today I want us to consider the fourth key to peace. That is to trust God's purpose. Trust God's purpose. In Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, we read, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. That's from the NIV. Or from the New King James Version, it's quite similar. It's trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. I want us to notice that there's some action words, verbs there that pertain to us, right? First of all, this idea of to trust in the Lord, to lean not on our own understanding, to acknowledge him in all our ways. And then there is the fourth verb of God's response, that he shall direct your paths, make our way straight. So this idea, first of all, to trust, right? Life doesn't always make sense. Things don't always go the way we plan. We look at, on a grand scale, wars and conflict where lives are destroyed and infrastructure is destroyed, and this is going to cost millions and billions of dollars, but they keep on destroying the infrastructure. They keep on killing each other. Why? Why do young people get cancer? Why do young people, children, disappear? Why did my marriage break up? Why don't things make sense? Why? I tried to do the right thing and still it didn't work out. Why? So many things beyond our control. Right? Why did that person have to die? Why did I lose my job? Right? We could have all kinds of whys. And so what do we need to do so we can have peace? Right? We have to trust in God's purpose. We have to trust in the Lord with all our heart. Right? There's a feeling component here that isn't just an intellectual thing, a real something right goes right deep within us to trust God with all our heart. Right? As opposed to trusting in our own simply in our own abilities or others' abilities or government or whatever. Anytime there's people involved, we know that there'll be failure. We'll get let down. Trust God with all our heart. Secondly, it was to lean not on our own understanding, right? This idea of our thinking. There's lots that we won't figure out in life. Or the answers we come up with won't be sufficient. Sometimes they'll be just downright wrong. And there's lots of people who think they got it all figured out, but we know as we watch, well, it doesn't quite turn out. Sort of like in our own country in BC, the idea is, well, let's just legalize all the hard drugs. That'll take care of the problems. No, it hasn't. For some people, it seemed like a good idea. For others, from the get-go, they would have said no. So the idea is not to lean on our own understanding of all the whys, but to recognize, right, that we don't have all the understanding to understand what God will be up to in his purposes and his plans. Thirdly, we're to acknowledge God, to acknowledge his presence, his power, his sovereignty, acknowledge he's the one that's in control, acknowledge that we won't understand everything he's doing. Not everything he'll say maybe makes sense. We recognize, right, that our behaviors and our actions that need to submit to God's way. That we want to acknowledge him. We want to submit to his ways. The thing is, you will never hear God say, whoops, made a mistake again. Right? So we want to trust God. We don't want to, with all our hearts, lean not into our own understanding of how things are, and to acknowledge or, shall we say, acknowledge God's presence and his ways and submit to his ways. And then lastly, we have this promise, right, that God will direct our paths. That God will allow some things that we may not understand, but God has a reason for it, and we need to just trust because we won't necessarily understand. And sometimes he uses hard things to bring us closer to the people that he is creating us to be, right? That sometimes those hardships are what develop the self-discipline and the character that we need. And sometimes the biggest thing we need to do is develop the ability to trust God even when there's part of us that just wants to freak out. We have to learn to trust God's purposes. Paul writes in Philippians 4:11-13, I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I have learned, okay? I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I've learned to be at peace, to be accepting, to be okay, to be at peace. I know what it is, he says, to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. Right? Paul learned. It just didn't happen overnight. It didn't just happen naturally. He had to learn to be content, to be at peace, whatever the circumstances. He learned what it meant to trust God and allow God to direct his life, right? To trust God with all his heart, not lean on his own way of figuring things out, but to submit to God's way, and then God led him in life, and he learned what it meant to experience peace, whatever the circumstances. A peace that was like, whoa, blow your mind. Life can be falling apart around me, but I can still be at peace. This is what Paul learned. Supernatural peace. We can look at the story of Job as an example. Job, he started out, he was a man. The book of Job, I guess I could go back to it. We read of one of the most basic questions that humans struggle with, and that is, why do bad things happen to good people? Why do we have to suffer? Why do we suffer even when we're trying to do the right thing? What's this about? And the story starts out describing Job as blameless and upright. He feared God and he shunned evil. He had a large family. He had great riches. He's described as the greatest man among all the people of the East. And the story is, of course, if you're not familiar with that story, there's this conversation with God and Satan, and things just start going downhill for Job. Loses his riches, then his family. But Job's response, right, is, it says when he loses all that, in Job 2:20-22, Job got up and he tore his robe and he shaved his head and he fell to the ground in worship, and he said, naked I've come from my mother's womb, and naked I will depart. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. May the name of the Lord be praised. Wow, hey? And then he's struck with this sores from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head. His wife says, why maintain your integrity? Just curse God and die. And Job's response is, you're talking foolish, woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Again, Job does not sin. His friends come and they see to comfort him, and they see he's so miserable. They don't even say anything. They just sit with him for 7 days. And then it's after that Job starts to really wrestle. He's miserable, and it's like, why, God? And his friends try to answer, and they're no comfort at all. And then it gets to the point where God speaks to Job. And he's asked Job, who are you really to challenge me? Who is it that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man, and I will question you, and you can answer me. Let me ask you some questions, Job, that will help clarify this. And of course, and he's like, where were you when I planned the universe? Created the world and the universe. Where were you? Where's your power to do things like I do? Where's your understanding? And of course, Job comes to place, right? I don't have anything. He says, I know you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted. You asked, who is this that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke of things I do not understand, things too wonderful for me to know. And so the story ends with Job repenting, and God moves in and just blesses him. He gives him twice as much stuff as he had before. He had more children, and he actually had this long life where he got to see his children to the fourth generation. And Job learned not only to trust God, but that he had no legitimate vantage point really to judge God's purposes from. That he didn't have the understanding to second guess God. That he came even more solidly to understand that that it was the wisest thing to trust God's purposes. And perhaps as we talk about having this peace that passes all understanding, a peace that is not affected by circumstance. As we look at Jesus in the boat on the cushion while the storm is happening, you may go, well, I'm not Jesus. Talk about Job. Well, he was a lot more mature than I. We may have excuses, but we have to recognize a couple things. This is supernatural, but that we have to lay hold of it, you might say, by doing certain things. Right? It was Paul. Remember, you might say, I'm not Paul, but Paul says, I have learned. This didn't come natural. It won't come natural to us. I have learned. Right? I have learned. How to be content. I have learned what it means to have peace. Right? This idea that my behavior, I need to obey God's principles. I need to accept God's pardon. I need to focus on God's presence. And then I need to trust God's purpose, God's plan. So let's talk in closing about one fella who didn't have much faith. When the heat came, he was a big bragger about things. Oh yeah, I'm there, I'm in, right, God? Like Jesus, I should say. I'm in, Jesus. But when the heat came on, he just disappeared. Like, in fact, when he was watching from a distance where he thought it was safe. And then, of course, he denied even knowing Jesus. He had fear. He knows fear. And yet in this story, this is how Peter learned as well. He didn't start out all brave and all peaceful, not at all. But he learned. And he found this peace of God as he trusted in God's agenda and God's purpose and God's plan. In Acts 12, we read this story. This is my concluding story. King Herod had arrested some of the Christians, right? Because it wasn't safe to be a Christian. And he found out, he had arrested some Christians, and he was intending to persecute them. And James, the brother of John, had been executed. And so the Jewish leaders, they liked that. And when the king saw that, he was like, hey, I know how I can work this to my advantage. And so he's gathering up these Christians so he can put them on trial, persecute them, maybe execute them. And he's got seized Peter. And that's exactly the plan. He has there's going to be a trial, probably followed by an execution. And so here we have Peter's arrested. The people are praying. And the night before the trial, likely the night before he's going to get executed, we'd say, what? Why? This isn't fair. I don't know how you would be feeling on the night before. But what we see is that God sends an angel to rescue Peter. And what situation does the angel find Peter in? Well, Peter's in chains between two guards, two soldiers, sleep, right? He's in between two soldiers and he's chained. And what does the angel find? Peter. And he's sleeping like a baby. Story tells us the angel has to give him a little slap to wake him up. Come on, Peter. Let's get going. It's time to leave. Why was Peter able to fall asleep and sleep like a baby? You might say, why was he at such peace that he was getting good sleep? Angel had to physically rouse him. It's because he was trusting in the Lord, right, with all his heart. He was trusting. He was not leaning into his own understanding. He was acknowledging God's presence, and God sent a way out. That Peter had learned to trust God's purposes and plan. And in so doing, he found peace, real peace. Supernatural peace. And if you want that kind of peace that isn't dependent on the circumstances, that isn't temporary, that will blow your mind, if you will, to use that expression, then we want to obey God's principles. We want to accept God's pardon. We want to focus on God's presence. And lastly, to trust God's purposes and plans for our life. In our next talk, we will talk about the last key. Thanks for listening.